This week, Starship V3 launches so other companies can fly. Major players in the industry have announced strategic moves to prepare for a future where we are sending much more and more massive satellites to space.
The best offense is a good defense when it comes to space, as large contracts continue to be awarded for capabilities that enable advanced sensing and communications for governments worldwide.
Oh, and one more thing. Space is seeing further signs of its iPhone moment as applications continue to materialize further up the value chain, leading to a more mature market that delivers on the promises to help improve life back on Earth.
Welcome to this week's episode of Space Times Podcast. As always, I'm Paul Mayer.
Here with Harrison Lambert.
Excited to share this week's space industry updates with you. We hope you enjoy the episode. Subscribe to our newsletter if you want the written breakdown of our episodes emailed to your inbox every Monday morning. Drop us a comment on our LinkedIn or Blue Sky with anything you enjoyed or would like to see. And as always, listen weekly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal.
This week, we had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Alexis Haroon, CEO of Juno Propulsion. We'll start with an excerpt from that interview before returning to our regular programming of headliners, defense, and commercialization.
All right, today on Space Times, we're very excited to welcome Alexis, CEO of Juno Propulsion, to talk to us about what you're working on with the rotating detonation rocket engine technology that you've been building at Juno Propulsion.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, so to speak.
So can you tell us a bit about your company and the technology that you're developing?
Yeah, so I am the founder and CEO of Juno Propulsion. At Juno, we're working on the next generation of rocket engines, everything from launch vehicle engines all the way to in-space propulsion. We use a core technology called rotating detonation combustion. This is essentially a way to supercharge rocket engines beyond what we can do today. And it uses this core technology called detonation, which means that we actually use basically shockwaves to like I said, supercharge the combustion efficiency of our engines. And so we can achieve performance at a specific impulse that we've never been able to before. And to do that, we are actually developing our first propulsion system that we're going to fly next year to demo it.
And this is something that you've tested in a lab, it works at test stands, or is it something you're still working to develop?
Yeah, so we've actually tested this, like you said, on a test stand. We've tested it in a vacuum chamber system, and we've been the only group that's actually shown the performance benefit of this technology. So essentially the idea is that we can outperform a conventional rocket engine by 5 to 10% what we can do today in terms of specific impulse. And we've shown that. We've shown that in a vacuum system. And essentially the mission that we're flying next year is to not only demonstrate that in the actual flight environment, but also to show that we can build the full propulsion system that surrounds it. So this is, what I have here is actually just what's called the combustion chamber or the thruster of the full RDC technology, that full propulsion system. This is where like the secret sauce is. So this is where we actually get that performance benefit. But we are also developing everything from the tankage to the fluid delivery, the avionics, the ignition system. That's all going to be packaged in this propulsion system that we're flying next year.
So a full drop-in subsystem for propulsion.
Exactly. You plug in, you bolt on to our system, you plug in electrical umbilicals, telemetry umbilicals. Essentially, you're off to the races.
Yeah, and your first flight is next year on a Vigoride 8 vehicle.
Yes.
This is fairly unique for rotating detonation rocket engines because at least the very few that do exist have positioned them very much towards hypersonics and launch, which you're not ruling out, but it seems that you're taking a slightly different approach, which is to go to space. What kind of led you to make the decision to pursue that avenue?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, we are doing RDC technology and propulsion systems for everything from in space. We'd also like to do upper stage engines. There's a lot of buzz around like space-based interceptors. Eventually, we would like to go and make launch vehicle engines. But really, the key premise there is doing RDC for space. And really, the biggest benefit there is if you can have a higher performing engine, you really enable a ton in terms of mobility to space and in space, which is kind of the main crux of, the challenge of getting to and operating in space. So we really see a huge benefit, a huge technology need for that. Why we're doing in-space propulsion first, when we were evaluating, honestly, our first product lines, a lot of it was centered around where's the customer need now, and especially since there's been a ramp up in things like defense presence in space, being able to move from A to B really fast is really important right now. And for customers as well, there's a big need to do things like rendezvous and proximity operations, whether that's refueling, that might be a more commercial use. On the defense side, it might be we need to go and inspect the satellite or see what they're doing. So really, there's just a really big need for high thrust, fast propulsion in space right now. And I'd like to say I won't say we predicted that kind of trend, but we definitely saw a big push towards that, especially over the past year. So I think we are well suited to enter that market, and our first product, I think, will be very substantial in being able to enable those technologies.
Yeah, space mobility is definitely an emerging trend that we've seen, at least for RPO and defense capabilities.
Absolutely. One of the key sets of challenges that we've seen people have difficulty in solving, it's been one of the reasons why sort of on-orbit propulsion of this magnitude hasn't really materialized yet, has been solving sort of the cryo environment, solving the storage of everything that needs to go into the rocket and the propulsion solution altogether. And so some of the more innovative, some of the more unique players in the space have designs and solutions that from the ground up don't need the sort of the cryo environment storage, that they don't need to worry. You can sort of put it in orbit and leave it on orbit for an extended period of time, and then at the drop of a hat, fire everything up, and you're able to go and intercept something that's coming in, or go and immediately achieve high impulse, high delta V performance. How does that sort of cryo and long-term storage challenge land on your ears, given everything that you've developed and worked on at Juno?
Yeah, so I will say that RDC, rotating detonation combustion, I call it a fuel agnostic and size agnostic technology.
Anything.
We can detonate anything. That's actually true. So we can do everything from this small guy to much, much larger engines. And so we have looked at cryo style engines. This is a storable propulsion system. It's actually powered by nitrous oxide and ethane, which are basically infinitely storable on orbit. But the main reason folks are looking at cryogenic solutions is because those are typically the highest performing fuels that we have, whether that's methane or hydrogen is kind of the king of all propellants. And that's really kind of, again, picking at this piece of customers needing the highest performance, highest specific impulse solution that is out there. So one way is to go, via choosing those propellants. For us, the other path is to actually use a combustion technology that just produces more specific impulse from the get-go. And so actually one of the main value adds for our technology is we are trying to compete with hypergolic solutions, which is another space storable solution. But the reason we typically use hypergols is that they're very high performing. However, it's extremely costly. You have to use special loading procedures. The supply chain is not that great for it. And we see a lot of customers wanting to have a solution where they can fuel up at the satellite assembly facility or even on the launch pad and not have to worry about all these, big expenses and complexities with loading hypergols. So really our product is kind of bridging the gap between offering a high performance solution without the complexity and the cost of a hypergolic solution.
Well, nitrous oxide and ethane are a great choice because it's also one of the trends we've been seeing in the refueling economy. Of that's one of the initial fuels they've been fitting a lot of the vehicles to use. And so having that space mobility mixed with space responsivity is, it's a very insightful path forward on that.
Yeah, I mean, it does make a lot of sense. We actually fuel this just with simple pumps, and it's a very common commodity, both nitrous and ethane. So we can just, as long as the natural gas business is booming, we're going to have propellant, which is awesome.
Just have to find oil on the moon?
Yeah.
Or is that...
Yeah, so that's another good question is, where do we go from here? Obviously, this is a somewhat small in-space propulsion system. It actually produces only 45 newtons of thrust. But as we look to further applications, things like operating on the moon, that might make more sense to actually have hydrogen, things like that. Then we would look at different architectures, new product lines for Juno. Probably scaled up, souped up compared to this guy. But this is our first foray.
That is a very interesting comment you make, that you're able to scale it up, because that's traditionally been the biggest challenge for this technology, and why I think there's so few competitors is nobody's figured it out. And like, there's been attempts, but what makes you so confident that you can scale it to like a launch vehicle sized engine?
So actually, this guy is not only going to be the first RDC that's flown on orbit ever, it's also the smallest one that's ever been demonstrated. So there are a couple.
That's to scale?
This is to scale.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a small guy. But actually scaling up is easier for us than it is with conventional technologies. In the past, one of the things that has plagued rocket engine development is as you scale up, you get these instabilities that want to shake the engine apart. That's actually one of the biggest challenges for rocket engine producers today, is when they go to scale up, that's what they encounter. With our engines, they're almost inherently unstable on purpose. So we actually embrace that behavior. And so when we scale something up, we're still unstable. That's the name of the game. We want that instability. And that's really the beauty of this detonation technology, is that it's, again, propellant agnostic and size agnostic.
Well, I'm curious, like, what kind of customers are you going for in terms of space companies? Because responsive space satellites is relatively new. I only know of a handful. Like, Portal Space kind of markets themselves that way. Impulse Space markets themselves that way. Like, are you expecting to stand up a whole new like class of agile spacecraft, or are you really expecting to be like a swap out for whatever thruster that those kind of companies are currently using?
So most satellite companies do use chemprop in some way, or of the ones that don't, they are interested in incorporating chemprop. And it doesn't have to be just for something like a defensive application. For some people, it's we want to get our satellite to geosynchronous orbit sooner than later, and start generating revenue.
Yeah.
There are other regulatory pressures, like the FAA requires some kind of deorbit or movement to a what's called a graveyard orbit now, and so there's a lot of push there too of being able to deorbit, things like that. So I would say we talk to both companies that, like you mentioned, are more specifically targeting both like this defense landscape and also just wanting to move quickly, and also I would say legacy companies, whether that's a prime or even companies, smaller companies that have existed for a while, that are interested in just having another product that enables their current fleet. So really, we talk with most satellite producers because there is an interest in this high performance chemprop.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
How can we help? How can we and our listeners help out Juno? What is it you need? What are you looking for?
I mean, I would say the number one thing is just to watch for our first flight next year. So this is going to be Q1 of 2027. We're flying as a part of the NASA Tech Leap program, and we're flying on a momentous with a rideshare vehicle. And yeah, demonstrating this for the first time, world first. We'd love to see people follow this mission, and we're really excited to show our stuff on it.
I'm very excited too. I know we're excited to see how it turns out. I'm sure it'll be great, and be cheering it on.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Alexis.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alexis.
So starting off at the biggest headline here, Starship V3 successfully launched on Friday, the 22nd. It was able to successfully launch, reach orbit, deploy the 22 dummy satellites, and then return and execute a controlled splashdown. It wasn't an explicit or unanimous success, as there were a couple of issues they ran into along the way. One of which was that the actual Starship engines themselves, only 5 of the 6 engines initiated or ignited. So they were able to reach an orbit that was, quote, within bounds, but it was still sort of on the lower end of that orbit. They weren't able to get to the preferred orbit for the demonstration. And then on the sort of final descent, the burn back, they only saw 2 of the 3 engines ignite and turn on there. So they weren't able to recover everything, but they were able to get the key objectives done for the mission. And they were able to successfully prove out that all of this works. Though there were those engine challenges that give them a little bit of a headache there, but stuff that I'm sure the team will be able to figure out and that they'll be able to solve and rectify moving forward. This is a pretty big success for the team, and it's undoubtedly going to reflect well on their upcoming IPO.
Yeah, so much like Paul recording with the cold right now, SpaceX was able to excel under handicap. As you noted, they lost 3 of their 33 booster engines on their booster. That threw off their deorbit burn a bit, so they didn't land where they wanted to. But booster continues to perform as they want. So, impressive that even losing boosters, they were able to succeed to an extent. That's kind of the point of putting so many freaking engines on one booster, is that they're able to, even when they lose a couple. So that's they've done that before. Still impressive, but kind of expected. The Starship was kind of the star of the show. This was the block upgrade from V2 to V3, kind of positioning it better for the lunar lander version of Starship, since they've been kind of pressured to accelerate that effort by NASA. This version of Starship actually carried some mass to orbit, as you noted. 20 of those 22 satellites were straight dummy satellites. The other 2 were called Dodger Dogs. So these actually tested out some of the Starlink components for the next version of Starlink. So some benefit there as well to their other business sectors. Those satellites, though, in this mission primarily were just testing out components, but they also provided imagery of Starship while it was still in space prior to its deorbit. So that Starship stayed up for quite a while before it did its boost back burn and landed in the Indian Ocean. That Starship lost an engine as well, which was unfortunate. It doesn't have nearly as many redundant thrusters on board. There's only 3 vacuum engines, as well as 3 RVAC engines. So these are their vacuum Merlin engines or Raptor engines. I kind of forget which one it is. These are their 3 vacuum engines. 3 of them have extended nozzles to be able to perform better under vacuum, and they lost one of those, so that didn't help with their deorbit. But during boost back, when they were able to flip from their belly flop to their landing position, they performed that spectacularly. It looked really cool. It flipped over onto its end right before touching down in the water, and it was able to show that it was standing up before it fell over and blew up into the ocean. Which pretty much demonstrated their capability to do what they're trying to do with Starship. So, as you said, not a resounding success, but on all fronts, a success nonetheless. Definitely a sign that Starship is progressing along. And, with the way they're able to perform, I feel they're going to kind of improve some of their engines. That seemed to be the main issue here. Their heat shields held up surprisingly well. Not surprisingly well. It was the block upgrade did have an improvement to it. So it was expected to perform better. And from all the video footage, it looked like they held up very well. All things considered, looks like Starship is moving along quite well. And I would expect on their next launch that, they're able to actually perform everything nominally and start carrying some payloads, some actual operational payloads to orbit. So great day for the industry. This is the heaviest lift capacity rocket in production or being worked on. So, these successes are a huge push forward for not just SpaceX, but everybody working in space.
I think the fact that they were able to accomplish all of the key objectives here, the actual launch itself, the lack of a rapid unscheduled disassembly, the deployment of the payloads, and then the successful sort of, we'll call it the belly flop reentry maneuver. All of that bodes really well. And, just from a production note here, I don't think that if you had mentioned that I was fighting a cold, I don't think the audience would be able to tell. I I don't think that really comes across on radio here that I've been kicked in the throat by a horse.
You're just getting a getting an even sexier voice.
Elsewhere in the U.S., York Space has acquired Celestial, and this is something that we spoke about pretty extensively. So we have been predicting that York Space is going to continue to acquire companies. We've been looking at both optical terminals and solar power. Optical terminals and solar power as like the two sort of biggest, we think some of the two biggest supply chain nodes that they would want to acquire and bring in house. And Celestial definitely falls within the solar power. So this represents York's third acquisition of the year to date. So we don't expect that rate to slow down anytime soon. They've been going quickly and growing fast and acquiring rapidly. I would expect that to continue. But they've now acquired the Orbium, their electric propulsion provider, Allspace, the comm terminal layer. And they've now acquired Celestial, which is a solar cell company off the back, all of which they've managed to do off the back of their IPO at the end of last year. So Celestial's focus is on a wholly domestic solar supply chain for space. And they're currently, I want to say they're at like 95, 98%, something like that. But they're already, the vast majority of the entirety of their supply chain is already domestically sort of grown and raised, so to speak. So York is clearly sort of positioning themselves as a sort of a purely domestic play, as a potential sort of differentiator for some of the government contracts that they're going after and that they're bidding for. We spoke last week about sort of the short seller announcement and some of the risks that poses to their sort of communication layer tranche in the proliferated warfare. I believe it was tranche 3. They're clearly not just sort of lying down and waiting to see what happens. They're being very proactive here. This acquisition has been in the works for a little while, but I would not expect them to really change strategy. Their strategy and their vision is clearly to still create this sort of homegrown domestic moat to position themselves to be the provider of choice for a lot of these communications government contracts. And the fact that government contracts do intend to avoid sort of, I'll say, king-making or specific monopolies on places. The fact that Starlink has won a couple of contracts here or there, they're not going to win all the contracts, and York Space is clearly positioning themselves to be the redundancy and the biggest player who is not that sort of single point of failure. So big accomplishment for the team there.
Yeah, this acquisition makes a whole lot of sense. As you noted, it's one of the key constraints, not just because the production scale is not able to keep up with the demands of space, but also because it plays into the critical material issue that we're seeing in the supply chain. Solar panels typically rely on some advanced materials like mercad or gallium arsenide. And this company actually kind of broke away from that stranglehold on materials by developing their solar panels to use just silicon. So unique kind of compound. It allows their solar panels to be flexible. It has a unique ability to be self-annealing at low temperatures. So it helps be resilient against radiation, which is one of the key factors to diminishing performance over lifetime of space missions. So this is a pretty advanced technology to acquire. They've flown on about 7 different satellites already, so they have some heritage behind them. And to me, it seems like it positions them well to play into the high power spacecraft market. We talked recently about York selling some 8 kilowatt buses to a commercial partner, which definitely plays into the role of high power communication satellites, which York seems to specialize at. This solar power technology should allow them to meet those demands for their existing high power buses, but also potentially scale out to higher volumes. Once you get above 8 kilowatts, the size of solar arrays grow pretty dramatically. Having a flexible kind of solar array that can roll up and deploy to larger volumes would be pretty key to meeting that demand. So definitely beneficial to York. As you noted, there are other acquisitions since IPO or Orbion for space propulsion, as well as All That Space for ground communications terminals. They also acquired Atlas Space for ground stations last year. So they're kind of shoring up a lot of their key chokeholds on deploying large power communication satellites. It mirrors pretty closely what Rocket Lab is doing with their acquisition strategy. Another public company with a strong cash arsenal to acquire companies. They're buying out some companies as well in the same space, although notably they're doing electric propulsion in-house, so kind of a different approach here. And they seem more focused on optics and robotics, which is kind of the next wave of spacecraft that we expect to be deployed. So, York is kind of filling in the role of core competency, more in line with what Lockheed and Northrop are able to compete with, but it definitely gives them a leg up in kind of proposing these sort of new space solutions for defense contracts, as well as it seems a growing list of commercial contracts as well. So great partnership for both of them. Hopefully, best of luck in integrating the two companies. That's always kind of a tricky thing to do, but seeing as how they've done this a few times, this should go a bit smoother.
Agreed. Congratulations to both the team at York and the team at Celestial. These are pretty big accomplishments for both of them. Speaking of high-powered buses, there's a pivot that I'm fairly certain Harrison and I have seen coming from a light year away, but Vast Space is pivoting out of the commercial space station business. And the announcement is that they're expanding their product offerings into the high-powered bus market. It's a change that we've sort of been expecting for a while. The fact that there never has been any sort of customer or product market fit for the commercial space station. The fact that NASA announced that they were reallocating funds, that they were deprioritizing commercial space stations. The entire thesis behind commercial space stations was that NASA and the US government would pay for it. So the fact that you were sort of losing money on a operational business, that you were a net negative cash flow business here, like that never really mattered because the customer was always going to be the US government. But the fact that the government's backing for that market got pulled, I believe, back in March, leaves sort of no surprise that the players in that space are going to look to find other ways to try and win market share and generate some revenues here. So no surprise that Vast is targeting another market. The high-powered bus market is a good one to target. That market has a lot of favorable tailwinds currently. So it's got a lot going for it. The big sort of challenge here, the big question basically boils down to commercial space stations have a very extensive set of technical expertise that one needs to have in their team in order to execute. High-powered buses similarly have a very extensive set of technical expertise. The big question is, how much overlap is there but in that Venn diagram? If it looks a heck of a lot like a circle, we can expect Vast to be really successful. If it looks less like a circle and there's sort of small amounts of overlap, like I would sort of expect, then we can expect Vast to give it their best, but that this would be a big challenge to overcome. I think that Vast is making a smart choice here in the fact that they're pivoting, and I think that they're pivoting into a very smart market. I think it's a good choice, but boy, is it going to be hard. It's already a little bit crowded. We spoke about York Space and their 8 kilowatt M-class bus. That it's possible that their acquisition of Celestial is intended to support the M-class bus, or they could be looking at going to an even higher powered baseline. But I think the primary value add is the fact that they're able to supply their M-class bus without any of the supply chain failure points that depend on international materials. Rather than the Celestial technology enabling them to go to like a 15 kilowatt bus or a 12 kilowatt bus, something like that. But all of that said, you know, Vast is pivoting into a competitive market. There's a lot of players who are currently building or planning to build 15, 20, and 100 kilowatt buses. So there's a lot of capabilities that are going to be coming to market. However, none of those capabilities have, for the most part, been realized yet. So, everybody's basically starting from zero. The folks who have a head start are the folks who have the expertise and the core competency necessary to execute on it. So we'll just have to see whether or not Vast's current technical personnel wind up having that expertise. But wish them and the team the best. I think it's going to be a big challenge, but I think they're up to the challenge. We'll just have to see how they're able to execute.
It's an odd pivot for Vast for sure. I think what the main downside I see is that they're one of the last movers to kind of react to what you noted, was that NASA is questioning the commercial viability for space stations that are run by private companies. A lot of them pushed back on that assertion when it was made a few weeks ago. But I think Vast was uniquely positioned to not be able to, to come out of that debate, unscathed. Axiom has been developing their own space station, but they've also been flying orbital data centers with Kepler. So they are already kind of well positioned to capitalize on another market should the space station market not be the profit center. A lot of these companies are asserting that it is. Voyager with their Starlab, space station is another example, but they've been sort of playing a Redwire playbook in that they provide components and solutions to a lot of other space applications as well. So both companies are very well positioned to not have to rely on their space stations. And even this week, Voyager partnered with Redwire. As I say, they're comparable to supply some components for attitude sensing to their SaberSat program under DARPA's Otter program. So we cut that because it was kind of a small story, but it does play into the fact that a lot of these space station providers are already seeing the writing on the wall when it comes to the business case and diversifying their companies to be able to weather that storm and continue pursuing the space station play. I think Vast is catching on to that now, but this pivot is a bit odd in that high power buses is an emerging market, but there are a lot of players that are better positioned to capitalize upon it. All the major players like Lockheed, Northrop, Boeing, they already have solutions for this. Like Lockheed has a 13 kilowatt bus under their Terran Orbital program they're using for PWSA. Northrop Grumman has a 20 kilowatt bus for the MEV platforms that they use for some geo satellites. The Viasat F3 satellite that we talked about a few weeks ago was built by Boeing. That's a 25 kilowatt bus. And K2 Space has a 20 kilowatt bus that's performing well in orbit and positioned to expand to a 100 kilowatt bus. So there's a lot of satellite players that have built out this capability already, have already flown it, have demonstrated its ability to integrate into defense and commercial systems. And like with York, even though it's 8 kilowatts, they have a ground station system that they're able to operate with this. And they're that positions them much better to be a flexible space solution provider. Whereas Vast, most of their systems are built up around orbital habitats. So having to support an additional use case of just traditional space applications on top of their orbital habitat efforts is a tall ask. The main benefit they have is that these space habitats are already high power, so some of the components can be reused. Primarily, their power system seems to be the key component that they're able to kind of pivot over to this new application. But there's a lot of other engineering that has to go along with this, and a lot of support that has to be provided if they were to pursue these missions. So it's a risky pivot for them, it seems. It doesn't play too well into their core business in terms of helping out with these space stations. But it'll be certainly interesting to see if they're able to create a cohesive ecosystem in which both these kind of spacecraft can exist. Because, we've talked about in the past orbital habitats serving unique value to some of these other applications like in-orbit manufacturing and orbital data centers where their human support systems are kind of an actual benefit to providing some capabilities to these other applications. So I kind of expect Vast to play into some of the next generation applications for space rather than just using the high power bus for things like communications. If they were to go that route, I think it makes a lot more sense in terms of expanding their operations and instead of just doing traditional spacecraft applications. For some more established demand for space capabilities, the defense agencies around the world are continuing to distribute huge awards for new capabilities. So the Space Force distributed a pair of awards this week under the same program. The PTS program is to establish secure military secure military communication satellites. So last year they had selected a few companies, down selected to a few companies, 5 in total, being Astranis, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Viasat, and SES. This week, they awarded a $437 million contract to Viasat and SES to develop and deploy 4 geo communication satellites under the PTS-G program. So Viasat and SES each will deliver 2 satellites to this program. The intention here is to build out a more resilient communication swarm, is what they're calling it in geo, versus the single spacecraft that they've had in the past. So 437 million, that's about 100 million per satellite. That's pretty cheap for a geocommunication satellite, but it sounds like they're trying to fragment out that capability amongst the 4. I most likely would see this as an actual dual win for Viasat SES as well as Boeing, seeing as how Viasat manufactured their F3 satellites under Boeing. So, Viasat SES, they don't manufacture satellites, they partner with manufacturers and they operate the satellites. So likely one of these other companies will benefit from that as well. I would reinforce the fact that it's probably Boeing, given that the other award was given to Northrop Grumman. That award was for $398 million to develop a PTS-P satellite. So that -P is a prototype satellite. This satellite is meant to be more resilient to jamming. And so Northrop is developing something very similar in terms of secure communication satellite, but with a little more advanced capability, which is probably why it's in the prototype stage rather than the -G stage for GEO. So of all these companies, it looks like the one that might not have won anything is Astranis. They have some other existing contracts with the Space Force to build out GPS communication satellites. So, they're not dead in the water, but unfortunately, it doesn't look like they won any of this layer of awards under the Secure Communication Satellite Program. And instead, it looks like a lot of these stalwart players are getting a cut of this award between Northrop, Boeing, Viasat, and SES.
Yeah, I think the Protected Tactical Satellite Program is going to continue to grow and see an extensive amount of funding in the coming years here. One thing that I'm actually surprised by is that, the majority of the contracts that we're seeing in so many words amount to secure communications, right? That's more or less what the contract is the capability that the contracts are trying to purchase. I'm surprised that we're not seeing IonQ engaged in any sort of capacity here, as the entire sort of value chain that they've been building towards has been this new layer of quantum communication, quantum compute, and quantum encrypted satellites, like end to end. That's the reason they bought Capella, who was again a SAR bus provider, but they bought Capella for all the nuts and bolts that they would need in order to build out their own. Presumably in order to build out their own communication bus here, repurposing existing expertise rather than in-housing and building it from scratch themselves. So, I'm not surprised to see all of the usual faces here, so to speak, but I am surprised that IonQ isn't yet sort of making that push to be a part of the PTS program, when that is effectively that's the niche that they've been building out and executing towards for years now.
Yeah, I would expect that they win in other contracts. I think that they're kind of playing in the next generation of communications, but this seems like a replacement for existing communication satellites, so something that would play well with the ground systems they already have deployed, as the 4 satellites that are going to Viasat and SES are for X-band and Ka-band, which are very traditional communications, but they had noted in the Northrop Grumman contract that it should be compatible across 16 different waveforms. So they're definitely looking at things like frequency hopping or operating in different frequencies than is more traditional, but definitely within the RF waveform, which is not as compatible with somebody like IonQ. But we have seen IonQ show up in other contracts. I think they showed up in Andromeda for Capella Space. So I wouldn't be surprised to see them in future contracts, but these awards definitely seem to be in the more traditional form of communication applications. So speaking of Andromeda, Rocket Lab got a $90 million contract for Heimdall, which is a space domain awareness contract. I say speaking of Andromeda because this is not tied to that Andromeda contract, and it's very curious that it comes out so closely alongside it. The Andromeda contract did capture Anduril as one of the winners of that. And last week we talked about Anduril partnering with Rocket Lab and Honeywell to deploy that sort of space domain awareness capability. So it's interesting to see Rocket Lab win its own contract for something so similar. It's unclear if that is tied to this Anduril partnership, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is some crossover benefit for both of them, tying those two kind of contracts together. The thing to note here is that this $90 million contract actually came before Andromeda. It was tied to GOST, which Rocket Lab acquired last year. So in closing this contract, it effectively transitioned over from GOST to Rocket Lab, who will now fulfill it using their GOST company. So GOST provided optical solutions for Rocket Lab, similarly to another optical solutions company they acquired this year. But GOST has some unique capabilities. We saw it deployed in Tranche 3 of the PWSA with their Starlight system, which was used to detect directed energy attacks. So this is interesting to see that they have other solutions that they provide for Rocket Lab to capture more defense capabilities, expanding this capability out to geo orbit, where they can then detect other activities beyond just directed energy and playing more in the traditional SDA sort of realm of things. But taken all together, I think this is the Space Force trying to build up resiliency for their geo assets. We've talked a lot about how geo, it's traditionally been these large, exquisite spacecraft that cost hundreds of millions of dollars and were deemed safe because they're so far out. But with more activities being shown between China and Russia for interacting and interfering with geo operations, the Space Force is taking a number of approaches to kind of build up resiliency at that layer between building out more spacecraft, like with that SES Viasat contract, as well as building out more awareness of interference with those spacecraft, like with this Heimdall SDA contract. On a European side of things, there are a couple of new kind of emerging contracts coming out that are playing in the same realm of space domain awareness. Helsing and OHB have formed the Kirk joint venture. This is to deploy a space domain awareness that's kind of AI enabled to monitor and secure on-orbit assets for Europe, Helsing being a French AI company and OHB being a stalwart German defense spacecraft company. There are a couple of other players in this joint venture, all contributing their core capabilities. But OHB is kind of the prime to develop all these space solutions and spacecraft that they're going to deploy. And Helsing is going to deploy the software layer for those satellites to enable AI at the edge monitoring of other spacecraft. So this is a bit of a difference from, what we've talked about with SCA on the US side of things. Certainly there will be some at the edge computing for American SDA, but this is a much more clear signal that they're trying to push for AI operating on the satellite to make more control and command decisions in space rather than routing it down through the Earth. UK did something very similar this week when inaugurating their space domain awareness software, Borealis. This is a software update to their existing on-orbit assets that will utilize the imaging assets they already have on orbit. They demonstrated this with the Noctis 1 spacecraft, which is actually a space telescope, but they turned it to image the International Space Station, demonstrating that they have already the on-orbit capabilities for imaging, and that this Borealis software would just augment that to do something very similar to Kirk, which is add software at the edge that can make decisions for tracking and command execution without having to route through the Earth.
I think it's really interesting both to see the Helsing and OHB joint venture and to see that joint venture and Borealis being more or less sort of deployed to solve the same or similar problems simultaneously. The impression that I have gotten from the US based attempts to pair sort of AI and space based defense has been much more exploratory than either of these announcements. So, like, point being that the impression that I'm getting from both Kirk and from Borealis is that there is a clear thesis as to what the problem is, and here's how we are going to work together to solve this problem in the place of Kirk, and here's how we are already directly solving this problem in the case of Borealis. I have not gotten that impression, or at least I haven't gotten the impression of that level of sort of clarity from either sort of Anduril or Palantir as to sort of like how they've been working or entering in sort of this partnering with the space industry to date. So it's interesting to me to see that there's, you know, so much more capital in the US market, but the specific sort of use case of AI as a layer in the defense stack or in the SDA stack on orbit seems to be a little bit fuzzier and a little bit less well defined than we're seeing it play out in Europe. That being said, I would be astounded if that remained the case for more than a couple of weeks here. I think the fact that there is so much money flowing into defense globally, and there's a clear sort of global push to get AI on orbit and to get this type of, we'll say, operations work solved and automated, because there's such a push to cut back on the operating costs of the satellites and to get, you know, faster insights, optimized maneuvering, what have you. I think it's a very sort of short lead that anybody may have. Any sort of head start here is going to be sort of competed and eaten away pretty quickly. So this is something that I'm really excited to watch sort of continue to develop.
Yeah. To your point, we've seen hints of it here. I think we talked a couple months ago about Northrop Grumman developing their own AI for fleet management. That could probably be easily deployed to their existing on-orbit assets, of which they're playing some role in SDA there. Helsing's worked with Loft Orbital on some of this technology that they're deploying to Kirk, so somewhat American. But certainly Europe seems way more gung-ho about deploying this stuff actively than the US. The US definitely seems a bit more hesitant, or at least more tight-lipped about it.
Maybe that's the better way to describe it. That the U.S. probably not actually falling behind, but definitely definitely being a little bit quieter about it.
Yeah, in a similar vein, synthetic aperture radar satellites are kind of a big thing for Europe. They've fallen a little bit out of favor with the U.S., although we do have companies like Umbra and Capella. But ICEYE has just been, knocking it out of the park month after month. This month, they delivered 4 synthetic aperture satellites to Poland. This was within a 12-month timeline, so it's an impressive turnaround for a satellite program. It was such a complicated technology and a relatively large fleet of 4. This is also playing in the trend that Poland is just, knocking it out of the park when it comes to space capabilities. For such a relatively small nation, they're building up space capabilities at an impressively high rate. I mean, within this past month, we talked about their consortium to build out geocommunication satellites, and now they have this partnership with ICEYE to do synthetic aperture radar satellites. So, impressive timeline for ICEYE. Yet another deployment of synthetic aperture radar for a sovereign capability, much like their partnership with Rheinmetall for Germany. So I'd expect to see kind of more of these sort of contracts, especially for ICEYE, with sovereign capability for synthetic aperture radar, especially in the European countries along that Russian border. this is a key capability for Poland, and it's great that they're able to deploy it so quickly. On the commercialization side of things, in our main topics, ISI had another announcement this week, which is that they are launching a catastrophe monitoring solution primarily focused on the banking sector. So this sector, this section of our main topics primarily focuses on space applications that are moving up the value chain to having more application on Earth. And this fits into the trend for ISI that we see in a lot of Earth imaging, Earth observation companies, which is that raw imagery itself is not all that valuable, but insights that you can gain out of that imagery is much more valuable to kind of adjacent sectors. So targeting the banking sector and particularly the insurance sector with this capability is a key maturation of ISI's capabilities. They are providing this near daily imagery in that synthetic aperture radar kind of wavelength that allows companies to better classify their risk for natural disasters such as flooding, hurricanes, earthquakes, and use that to better price their insurance claims and their banking risk postures. There are some other notes of just general climate and natural disaster monitoring and response capabilities. So by all means, this is not a one sole purpose kind of capability, but it is a new kind of layer of feature that ISI is offering to the market to provide more actionable insights on top of their imagery, as well as providing their historic imagery for kind of backwards looking assessment of historic trends in climate or in natural disaster reaction. So I think it's paired well with their core offering, but it is definitely a step forward in how they're actually able to offer that to the end customer, much like we've seen with companies like Planet and Vantor developing a lot of software solutions that they offer to their end users to allow them to act on space data more quickly and with more insight and value. On the similar note, Amadeus IT Group has announced that they're using Spire's aircraft tracking data, specifically the ADS-B, which is a form of communications data that they gather from airplanes for better airport management tools. So this will allow them to kind of keep track of all the airlines to not just create better management systems for these airports to make sure that things are running smoothly, but also to run simulations and kind of tabletop exercises to improve the capability of airports. So we've talked recently about aircraft capabilities. I think Arion was acquired last week for their in-flight kind of tracking system. We've talked a lot about direct-to-device and communications companies like AST Space Mobile and Amazon Leo partnering with space or aircraft providers to provide in-flight communications. So aircraft seems to be one of the main sectors of quote unquote Earth applications, seeing as how they're flying through the sky, to use spacecraft to much effect. This is an interesting expansion upon that, as it's not like traditional in-flight communications or just aircraft tracking, but adding a further layer of value in that able to help with the development of airports, kind of similarly as we're seeing to ISI's announcement, is development of terrestrial infrastructure by using space data is a huge improvement that can be provided through these applications. And an application that's a bit further from Earth, Perfect JSAT has invested in Astroscale to partner on on-orbit servicing capabilities. So SkyPerfect JSAT is a more traditional geocommunications satellite provider, although they've also worked on non-geo applications such as Earth observation with Planet. So really, they're just like a Japanese kind of large-scale satellite operator. Astroscale also being a Japanese satellite provider, this partnership makes perfect sense. Developing developing a pretty cutting-edge space capability like the RPO and ISAM services that Astroscale is providing in partnership with a more established provider like JSAT. And this makes a lot of sense for a company like JSAT who has to manage geocom satellites. We talked last week about Intelsat, Eutelsat, SES terminating some contracts for geocom, and we proposed that the reason for that was that a lot of their geocom assets are surviving longer than they expected, and they don't need to use that capital expenditure to replace them so soon. And we, posited that part of that might be that on-orbit servicing is starting to come into vogue. It had a long time coming. There's been a lot of struggles with actually implementing on-orbit infrastructure, but with this sort of partnership, it gives a clear kind of user case for a company like Astroscale to actually deploy their capabilities to a customer that could use it to see real material benefit to their core business. So something like JSAT could keep their geocom satellites on orbit longer using Astroscale to service and refuel them, which would be a huge shift to the geocom market, and one that will likely be propelled forward by this partnership.
All right. So the biggest business move this week is undoubtedly SpaceX's S1 prospectus filed with the SEC. So we're all aware that the target valuation for the IPO is up to $2 trillion, and that the offering is intended to raise $75 billion. But there was additionally a lot of sort of operating information that we otherwise don't really have access to. So the overall sort of, I'll say, conclusion is that there's a lot of confirmation bias. So if you like SpaceX, you don't like what you see. So there's sort of a mixed bag in here. But the big picture stuff is that SpaceX and XAI, everything is a money loser with the exception of Starlink. So Starlink is the only aspect that actually earns money in SpaceX, and it basically subsidizes everything else. So some of the numbers to that were that they saw sort of total revenue of about 18.5 billion, 18.67 billion, but saw almost a net loss of about 5 billion. And that net loss is driven primarily by really heavy CapEx spending, most of which is dedicated to the AI build out. So, for example, quarter one of 2026, they saw an operating loss of 4.28 billion on almost 4.7 billion in revenue. And again, it's Starlink that's earning all the money. SpaceX is losing money per launch that they put up. They are losing money in XAI. They're losing money in every sort of aspect of the business other than Starlink. But Starlink is so lucrative that it's subsidizing everything else and sort of blowing everything else out of the water. So they did win sort of that big contract with Anthropic for like $1 billion, $1.25 billion per month for use of their supercomputer. And we spoke about sort of the plans to potentially start building out data centers in space. Notably, that announcement didn't include anything in writing for any sort of orbital space data centers. It was just the thought of a potential sort of possible maybe future. The contract itself is only written for the compute and the AIs, the compute and cloud services coming out of the supercomputer in Memphis. But there's still that potential here. So the S1 prospectus touches on that as well. As for the actual sort of release itself, so Musk will own over 40% of the company, just around 42% of the total equity, but control about double that in voting power. So Musk is still very much in control of everything, and his equity compensation includes a trigger for 1 billion shares that vest only when SpaceX establishes a permanent human colony on Mars with at least 1 million inhabitants, million with an M. So Musk is still very much in charge, and it's publicly available information that there's a massive amount of upside incentive for him to continue to push for the Mars colony. So that is in the prospectus as well. They are actively allocating about 30% of the offering directly to retail investors. Another company, which has become a case study, in fact, to do so was Google back in 2004. Google's IPO, they wanted to be majority controlled by retail investors. Unfortunately, it backfired. It went very poorly, and they wound up being one of the most privately owned, one of the most privately concentrated IPOs in history. Granted, the retail investor landscape is unrecognizable today compared to 2004. So getting access to and getting buy-in from retail investors and from the public for an IPO today is night and day difference to the means and methods that one would need to do in order to do this back in the early 2000s. So this type of allocation will be super easy to fill in comparison. So no reason to believe that this will backfire in any capacity.
No, who would think that? Yeah, I think going into this filing, and we've been talking about, their IPO for months now, and that $1.75 trillion price tag just seemed insane. But now having some real numbers to put behind it, I actually came out of this filing feeling like it was less insane than I expected. For them to be generating, $18 billion just off of Starship Starlink is a huge accomplishment. Like that's a really solid income. And you noted that, I don't know if you mentioned it, I see it in the notes here, but like Anthropic is now paying them $1.25 billion per month for AI. So kind of the two core breakdown to their, total projected market cap was that, $2 trillion of that is towards space, and the other like $20 trillion of that was towards AI. I think the fact that they have real numbers behind revenue for both of those makes it seem a little less outlandish, I'll say. At a price of $2 trillion, having $30 billion of income actually makes their PE pretty reasonable by Musk standards. Like I think it's a 60 PE ratio, which if you look at Tesla, it's like a 400. Yeah. So like given Musk standards, 60 is actually not that crazy. And I could actually see their stock going up in the near term. Long term, a lot more of it is faith-based there's huge potential for AI. There's huge potential for the moon and Mars. But all of that is just, it's projection. It's not really based in the current reality. So taken together, I think that, a 60 PE ratio is not the most insane thing to invest in and none of this is financial advice, but it's not the craziest thing to invest in for some sort of frontier tech stock like SpaceX, especially given their track record, because you're betting a lot on, the faith that, Elon and SpaceX can accomplish these sort of outlandish claims that they're stating in this prospectus. And ultimately, that's what space is it's looking to the future and all the things it can promise. But of all the companies, like this is a huge, income to kind of back up those claims. And so, altogether, awesome S1, definitely worth a read. It's a lot of waxing poetic about what the future of space and humanity will look like. But, I think it's actually, I don't know. I don't want to say financially sound, but like there are some real numbers to back up the prices they're putting on things.
Elsewhere, domestically, Blue Origin is reportedly considering accepting some of their first external money. So this was reported by two unidentified sources, sharing with reporters under anonymity. So clearly, this is something that Blue Origin doesn't want to publicly announce. Clearly, they're not excited or eager to take on external funding. But the reasoning behind it was, in so many words, if we want to increase our launch cadence, we need a lot more capital. This is something that you and I have spoken about extensively, that their launch cadence currently is not able to deliver on any of the contracts that they have. They're simply not able to get enough satellites up. So if they want to be able to get enough satellites up to be able to service the contracts that they have to increase their launch cadence. And so, I'm not particularly surprised to see this, but it does represent a pretty sizable change to the potential governance for Blue Origin. Blue Origin to date has been effectively privately financed by Bezos. Bezos has just been more or less selling Amazon stock on an annual basis and paying Blue Origin's R&D and CapEx and operating expenses out of pocket. So the biggest change here is to the governance of the company, in so many words. If you go from just having the one effective investor in Jeff Bezos to now having multiple investors, those other investors are going to want to have insight into how the company is being run, how it's being executed. You won't exclusively be beholden to Jeff Bezos anymore. You'll now have sort of a fiduciary duty to all of the shareholders and whatever their priorities and whatever their goals for the company are as well. Though voting rights will undoubtedly still remain in Jeff Bezos's favor, there will be some sort of governance changes. So the style of leadership and the style of the how the company is led would exhibit some sort of change. So I don't view this necessarily as like a huge or like a seismic shift in how the company would be executed or how the company would be led, but it would mean that there would have to be some sort of functional and operational changes on some level.
Yeah, the anonymous reporting came from all hands within the company. So it sounded like the context was that Blue Origin is restructuring some of their employee stock incentives, which doesn't sound like a good thing to me. It certainly sounds like they're starting to feel the pressure, but on the flip side, they're arguing that, SpaceX IPOing kind of sets a price. They've kind of priced the market for the sector that Blue Origin is competing in. So maybe it's a little bit of what we've been seeing with a lot of other space companies, which is like, now is the time to raise that money if you need to, because SpaceX is going to shake everything up. And Blue Origin is kind of seeing that as if we're ever going to do it, now is the time.
Yeah, I think the reporting said that they didn't explicitly talk about an IPO, but they also didn't explicitly rule it out.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see whether they mean, external funding in the source of like private capital or external funding in the source of a public offering. Tomorrow IO has raised an additional $35 million of additional capital for their $175 million Series F. Their Series F was closed earlier this year. The additional $35 million brings the total amount of capital raised for the Series F to $210 million. This extension was led by Pitango, which is one of their current partners already on their cap table, who is already involved in the Series F, and brings in Pitango's partner, Harrell Insurance. So the focus of the Series F was earlier in the year to deliver on Deep Sky, the first AI-enabled weather satellite constellation, and it remains focused on the same. And this is additional investment from strategic partners. So, it represents both effectively a partnership with some of their biggest customers and also a really strong vote of confidence in their business model and product offerings. So congratulations to the team.
Yeah, I'd expect some of this money to be going towards some of the more defense-focused applications for weather forecasting that we saw recently. I think it was Planet IQ that got the contract through the U.S. Space Force a couple months ago. But it was an interesting argument to be made that, there's lots of U.S. defense assets around the world that need weather forecasting. It's useful for aircraft. It's useful for just operations in general. So it could be that there's some demand signal that Tomorrow is seeing for their application outside of just traditional weather forecasting that would warrant needing additional capital to invest in some of their new technology like Deep Sky.
Zank Space announced a $26 million raise here ahead of their June debut launch for the Zhihang-1 kerosene liquid oxygen rocket. They have raised $26 million to get them through that. The Zhihang-1 is a kerosene liquid oxygen launcher that is capable of moving 4 metric tons to a 500 kilometer sun synchronous orbit. It's not currently a designed to be reusable, though the hope is that they have sort of enough parachutes and airbags that they'll be able to recover and refurbish some of the core engines and different components in the rocket on their return. They're going for a splashdown return, but their longer term plans are to have the rocket eventually be fully reusable. Though it's not currently reusable in its current stage.
And just another Chinese rocket. I've lost count at this point.
Yeah. Mach Industries also acquired X Quadrum for $50 million. The acquisition was conducted very quickly. I believe Mach Industries first started with X Quadrum as their customer about 5 months ago. So in less than 6 months, they've gone from signing their first contract to fully acquiring and integrating the company. And it's an interesting integration. It continues the trend of sort of scope style acquisitions that we've been talking about, but unlike other scope style acquisitions, where for the most part, you sort of let the other company sort of do what they want to do. Mach Industries has already sort of fully integrated the team. In a scale acquisition, you'd typically sort of buy them, you'd buy a company and then eat them. So you'd cut a whole bunch of people, you'd cut a whole bunch of stuff that you don't need, and you'd sell a whole bunch of your existing products to now their customer base and sell their products to your customer base. But that's not what's happening here. So Mach Industries has absorbed in its entirety the 85-person team of X Quadrum, bringing the total sort of staff at the company of Mach Industries now to about 350, something like that. But effectively, they just grew their company by 30% through the acquisition. And this was a competitive process. Mach Industries claims that they beat out, I believe, 8 other suitors for X Quadrum. So Solid Rocket Motors, the component and the sort of core competency of X Quadrum, what they actually make, Solid Rocket Motors, remains and continues to be one of the critical bottlenecks in the American defense industry here. So very much following on with a lot of what we were talking about earlier in the spring and in the winter of solid rocket motors and solid rocket boosters being a critical component and a key bottleneck, both for defense and for space purposes. We're seeing that continue to play out in real time.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I included it this week, is because it's not a space story, but it's very adjacent. Like you said, we've been seeing this a lot recently. Like, critical bottlenecks have been the core reason for most of the acquisitions we've been seeing within the last month. And this crosses over enough with space that it's relevant to keep an eye on. As you noted, there were like 8 different companies competing for this, which makes me curious what those other 8 companies are, because in a lot of the cases recently, they've been space companies. Like, we saw Voyager Technologies acquire ST's Energetics for their solid rocket motors. That is a space company, so it's very space focused there. We've seen Avio get huge contracts and make large moves throughout the US and Europe based on their solid rocket motor technology. We have Anduril getting large contracts from the US government as at the same time as they're expanding into the space industry and starting to stand up some space-based interceptor technology. So a lot of this is important to keep an eye on because of the Golden Dome initiative and the expansion of rockets into space-based capabilities, as well as just launch vehicles. There's a number of launch vehicles that use solid rocket boosters. The Ariane 64 configuration uses it, as well as the 62. We have the Vulcan that uses them from Northrop Grumman. We have the SLS that uses giant ones for moon missions. And we have companies like Orion Space out of China that are using completely solid-based rockets to launch spacecraft into orbit. So I think solid rocket boosters are having a sort of comeback. They were bigger, back in the day, and they definitely have their downsides. But, between missile production, hypersonics testing, and different kinds of configurations for launch vehicles, they are becoming a critical need. And I think with a lot of these bottleneck components is that the demand is rapidly expanding while the supply has been used to such a small scale production that they're not able to keep up. So a lot of this consolidation is meant to give them the capital and the kind of backing they need in order to close these deals and actually deliver at the scales that they're promising.
Absolutely. I mean, so one thing that I would actually be really interested, for all of our friends at what was formerly X Quadrum, we would love to have you on the show. But I would love to better understand what some of the other suitors were, because I'm willing to bet that Mach Industries was not able to make the most competitive price offer for X Quadrum, but that the team at X Quadrum wanted to join Mach Industries because their offer was for effectively them to become a part of the family. And so I'm willing to bet that with one or more, with multiple offers on the table, X Quadrum was in a position where they were able to choose what they would like, who they wanted to work with. And I'm sure that the nature of Mach Industries' integration of X Quadrum was a major sort of differentiator. For example, had sort of a Rocket Lab acquired them, right? Maybe the price tag would have been higher, but they Rocket Lab would have, a bigger, more well-established company would very likely have just bought them and ate them. And so I would be completely surprised if that sort of acquisition included landing spots for the entirety of the staff and kept on the leadership team in sort of key and critical roles at both the acquired or even at the acquiring companies. So I'm sure X Quadrum, if they had multiple offers on the table, were more excited to work with Mach Industries because of the sort of plan that they had in place for what working together and moving forward would look like.
For the tech advances this week, we have a couple of new contracts that are out for bidding. One is out of Canada, between the DND and ISED, which are kind of the Department of Defense up there, as well as a scientific agency department. They are launching a $5.5 million in challenges. So that's multiple for Arctic optical communications and quantum repeaters. The quantum repeaters part is the particularly interesting part of this. Obviously, it's leveraging optical communications to serve as that repeater. But the purpose here is to kind of expand quantum communications to a more global coverage. In this particular challenge, it's specifically for the Arctic, so they're looking at Canada in particular. But one of the quirks of quantum communication is that it can't be intercepted without kind of collapsing the quantum entanglement. And so part of this is technically challenging because they need to find a way to do that, because they'll need to basically capture a quantum communication signal and then repeat it out to another one. There are some theories as to how to do this. There's something called the Bell process that allows you to kind of measure the incoming quantum signal and then create it again and then pass it along to the next repeater. But this is certainly a unique application that I haven't seen in other quantum systems like IonQ or PsiQuantum or anything like that. It is playing into the trend that Canada is very focused on quantum. They have a lot of talented quantum researchers in their universities, as well as some quantum companies up there that are doing some really neat things. I think we most recently talked about SB Quantum, which was doing a quantum diamond gravitometer. But there's all sorts of research and projects coming out of there. So it seems that Canada is very focused on quantum. I think rightfully they're recognizing that as a technology that can leapfrog a lot of current capabilities and would put them ahead if they're able to accomplish it. And so putting some money behind developing this capability is critical for their space endeavors. On the U.S. side of things, there's a challenge coming out of the United States Space Force and their Space Works organization. Between the two, they manage about $32 billion worth of contracts. This is kind of open-ended amongst that. It's set for a bunch of things regarding orbital logistics, but is really playing into kind of the orbital transfer vehicle and ISAM sectors of space. So this is one of the most concrete requests for contract that I've seen come out of the U.S. government. where they explicitly call out things like orbital fuel depots and orbital transfer vehicles and refueling and multi-mission vehicles that can go out and service U.S. assets. So, this is an industry we talked about a bit recently. It's sort of having a comeback in that orbital transfer vehicles were big a few years ago, but couldn't find their market fit. And now between things like geocom satellites needing longer lifetimes, as well as space defense becoming a bigger issue, and RPO capabilities to compete with China and Russia are becoming an increased priority for the U.S. government. This seems like a very interesting challenge to put out there alongside some of their other more traditional contracts like the SBIRs and the IDRS or the IDIQs that they've been putting out recently for things like Andromeda and Golden Dome. I think this will influence a lot of what the next wave of contracts will look like under Golden Dome, in particular, and potentially for other contracts that might come out under the newly restructured United States Space Force. Well, that's a wrap for this week's recap of the space industry. We hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, please drop us a comment, check out our socials, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Until next time, this is Harrison Lambert and Paul Mayer signing off for now.